Welcome, everyone. Today, I wanted to speak about some ideas that we have been working with recently on the limits of artificial intelligence. So we spoke recently about artificial intelligence, so some of those limits we mentioned already, but today we'll go a bit deeper into them. And I think it's important to speak about this because there has been, as you know, lots of enthusiasm in recent years about the potential of artificial intelligence, and that has led to non-realistic expectations of what we might expect from this technology. And that, I don't think that it's like leading to terrible consequences, but some non-desirable, for example, investments or predictions or worries. So at different levels, it seems that we are not necessarily focusing on what we can really do with this technology, but speculations on what might happen in a few decades. So it will be useful to have a better notion of the possibilities, of the real possibilities of artificial intelligence. So I think we can speak about inherent limits of artificial intelligence as we have developed it now, to make our expectations a bit more grounded in this insight. So just to recap a bit of history, the idea of creating artificial creatures has been with our species since antiquity. Many myths speak about humans creating either life or creatures or intelligence. We could say a bit like trying to play God. So this was always with our cultures, but it was only when clockmaking became a bit more sophisticated that the first automata were developed, and then robots were coined a bit more than a century ago, and this began to, let's say, be used about 50 years ago in different industrial settings and military settings. And of course, nowadays we have very sophisticated robots. You might have seen some of these videos. Of course, that's a fake video, but there are some interesting videos from Boston Dynamics, not this fake Boston Dynamics, that show that robots have acquired new capabilities and they do some impressive things, but still they are limited and they work in specific environments. So many people speak about artificial general intelligence, not only in robots, but in computers in general. But I think this will never be achieved. So I will try to give arguments against artificial general intelligence, and basically different limitations that our technology has. And this cartoon from Safely Endangered kind of illustrates one of the points that I'm trying to make, that our computers are very bad at generalizations. So they kind of extrapolate based on information that we provide them or that they are trained with, but then it's almost impossible for them to go beyond that. So already in the 1980s with expert systems, there were some projects like the SIG project, or CYC, I don't know how people pronounce it. They basically start making lots of rules, like, I don't know, birds fly, penguins are birds, but penguins don't fly. Like, you will always find exceptions. So they try to make a huge database so that this engine would be able to reason and have more or less conversation and kind of give you answers on all the knowledge that it was accumulating. And the assumption was that once you had enough knowledge encoded, then you would be just like a human. But in spite of decades of this project kind of putting more and more and more and more rules and releasing more and more versions, the quantity never translated into quality. I mean, the limits were still there and are still there. The expert systems are unable to generalize. And of course, if you ask something within their domain, they're able to answer. But if you go beyond that, then the best thing they could do now is to search on the internet, like personal assistants now, like Siri or Alexa, say they can do many things, but they are unable to go beyond what they were programmed to do. So of course they are limited. It doesn't mean that they are not useful or that they cannot acquire with new versions, new functionality, but they're inherently limited in the sense that if we want them to do something that they were not programmed for, then they can't do it. And of course, since 70 years ago, Turing in his 1950 paper, he already spoke about, say, teaching computers. Of course, he joked that this wouldn't imply sending them to school because other kids would bully them. But let's say, basically, he was already thinking about learning algorithms so that, let's say, you don't have to program explicitly everything that we do. So in a similar way that we go to school and we learn things, then machines should have also a learning process so that we design, let's say, the mechanisms, and then the knowledge is acquired through experience. And of course, this is much more feasible than hardwiring that knowledge. And most of the methods of artificial intelligence nowadays do precisely this. We are not explicitly telling algorithms what to do, but we develop algorithms that they will find by themselves what to do. I mean, the artificial neural networks is a classic example of this. So you train them with data, but they are unable to go beyond that data that you train them with. I mean, they're unable to find new patterns. Of course, there's some debate about this. So, for example, AlphaGo, that was this program developed by DeepMind for playing Go, and it made the headlines because it was considered a very complicated game. I mean, more than chess, because the possibility space explodes much faster than with chess or checkers. But anyway, they managed to beat one of the best human players. And in some cases, some people say that there was some creativity in what they were doing. And we could say, yes, there is creativity, but it was kind of exploration of new strategies under very specific circumstances. I mean, the rules of Go didn't change. Those were set. So, of course, if there are different paths, let's say, suppose you have a mountain and you want to get to the top, you might build some robots and teach them, okay, this is one path to climb the mountain. And then suddenly they find another path and they also climb the mountain. And then we say, oh, yes, they're creative. And I would say, yes, they're creative, but that's very limited, because what we want and what we humans do is to create new mountains. And still, for machines, we need to give them the mountain. And then they can find different paths to reach the top, even when we cannot see the top, but we need to give them the mountain. So this so-called artificial general intelligence developed by companies like DeepMind and others supposedly do many different things. But I think that's just like a combo AI, meaning that you take a program that is good at one thing, like language processing, and you take another program or algorithm that is good at, I don't know, locomotion, and you put them together, and then you have a robot that speaks. And that's not general. It's just like, of course, it enhances the capacity of each, but that doesn't go beyond the limits of each program. It's just combining the abilities. You have different programs for different functions. And artificial general intelligence aims to be able to learn to do things a system was not built to do. So, for example, that you build a robot for walking, and then it can also dance, or drive, or cook, or play games. And of course, it doesn't happen. If you design a machine to walk, they might even run, but not much more. So in a similar way, if you design a system to drive a car, it won't be able to drive a motorcycle, and vice versa. AlphaZero kind of tried to go a bit broader because it was a system that supposedly was not taught specifically to play games, and then it learned in different instances to play chess, shogi, and go. But at the end, all of these are board games with, let's say, more or less similar rules, in the sense that you have two players, and so the system was able to derive the rules of these games, but it wouldn't be able to play Monopoly, for example, or tic-tac-toe. Well, maybe tic-tac-toe, yes, but some other board game that has a different nature, they wouldn't be able to play it. So all of the artificial intelligence that we have developed, we could say that it's specialized, but it seems that most of the things that humans do, or most humans, we can say that we are generalists. And of course, there are many differences, but one of them is that we can manage exceptions properly. And computers, basically, if you go out of their domain, they don't know what to do. And somehow we find a way of doing it. So how we do it, that's one of the things I want to discuss. And another argument, but I won't spend too much time discussing it because it's not very scientific, is this idea of the singularity that has been taken out of context. So it seems that the first one to speak about the technological singularity was John von Neumann, but he meant like a big transition, or basically that the rules of our society would change, more from the physicist's perspective of singularity, that let's say in a singularity like the Big Bang, the laws of physics don't apply. That's what physicists understand for a singularity. But then people like Ray Kurzweil took it out of context, and then they made these wrong assumptions about exponential increase, and then somehow they assumed that this would tend to infinite when exponential curves reach infinite only when the time would be infinite. And then they made these claims that we would be able to download ourselves to computers, and they speak about super intelligence, whatever that might be, and some other things that kind of just add noise to the conversation, and I don't think they should be taken seriously. So yeah, I mean, the singularity as von Neumann envisioned it, I think we have been going through it slowly, gradually. But the singularity as people like Kurzweil envision, I think it's nonsense. So if we go back to the early 20th century, David Hilbert was perhaps the most famous mathematician alive. And he was at the University of Göttingen in Germany, and it was considered like the Mecca of mathematics. Also, one proof of this is that in 1900, in the meeting of the Mathematical Society, or well, perhaps that's not the precise name, but like World Congress of Mathematicians, he posed a list of problems for the century, and some of those were solved and some of them are still open, but it kind of guided the development of mathematics, at least in the early 20th century. And in the 1920s, let's say, what is known as Hilbert's program, so it was Hilbert and many other people, they were trying to prove that mathematics were trustable, meaning that if you would say something with mathematics, you could be certain that it would be true. And people like Russell and Whitehead were following this. So perhaps the Principia Mathematica of Russell and Whitehead are better known than Hilbert, but they were motivated by Hilbert's program. So they were able to express all of the known mathematics, well-known arithmetics by that time in terms of logic. So that was like a step forward. And then in the 1920s, John von Neumann, what was that? His PhD thesis? I forget, but like some of his, or I can't remember, perhaps he was still in high school or university. Well, he was still very young. And he showed that, no, I'm getting confused. No, John von Neumann showed something, and then Gödel showed for his, I forget whether his bachelor's or PhD thesis, but in any case, he was very young, like in his early 20s. Kurt Gödel showed that first order logic was complete. That was one of the steps towards the Hilbert's program, because he wanted to show that all of mathematics were complete. But then the same Gödel, in the late 20s, he showed with his now famous incompleteness theorems that mathematics, and in general all formal systems with certain peculiarity, because of course the first order logic is complete. Well, he showed that mathematics are not complete and inconsistent. Incomplete and inconsistent. So this means that incomplete meaning that there are some phrases that you cannot prove whether they're right or wrong. Say intuitively, we can say that you will find paradoxes in these formal systems, and Hilbert was against paradoxes, like many other logicians. They want to get rid of them, like the liar's paradox, where you say, I am lying. So if you are lying, then you're telling the truth. But then if you're telling the truth, you're lying. And I mean, of course, these paradoxes were known since the ancient Greeks, at least. And also what is known as Russell's paradox was kind of addressed in these years, which could be seen as a version of the liar paradox. And then inconsistent means that, inconsistent is that you will find contradictions, and incomplete means that you will have statements that cannot be proven right or wrong within a formal system. So that was like a shock for mathematics, because supposedly mathematics should be able to do everything, or let's say they wanted it to be complete and consistent. And then in 1936, Church and Turing in parallel proved that that formal systems are not decidable. And Turing did this actually by defining computing machines with what is now known as a Turing machine. I mean, there were some prequels to that, like Post had a similar machine that it was also a tape, and then you could just write one cell. So, I mean, it's not like Turing got this out of the thin air. There were many ideas that led to Turing's work, but I mean, he made the breakthrough. And also Greg Chaitin, when he was in high school, he also kind of made further proofs. Basically, that you cannot prove that the number is random. So that kind of also limited the scope of Hilbert's program. So, I mean, all this is well known. We're speaking about almost 100 years ago. And this kind of had a huge impact in mathematics before computers were developed, the digital computers were developed. Still, and actually, Turing was one of the first. I mean, he was one of the ones that we could say destroyed Hilbert's program. But at the same, he was one of the first who was interested about artificial intelligence, or in other ways, simulating cognitive processes in machines, whatever that might be. However, it seems that few people have noticed that all our artificial intelligence systems are suffering from the same limits of formal systems, because at the end, our computers need consistent logics to run. So we could say that the limits of formal systems also apply to artificial intelligence. So therefore, it seems that this prevents our artificial systems from being general. But then, of course, the question is how do we do it? Like something intuitive is like, well, if we can do it, then we can build a system that imitates us good enough so that they will be able to do it as well. So many people have wondered whether our minds are computable in Turing sense or not. Now, remember that we can notice a difference between computability in theory, that would be Turing's, and computability in practice. Computability in theory, I mean, we have, for example, pi is computable in theory, but in practice, we don't have time in the universe because it's an infinite number to calculate it completely. And also there are non-computable functions like halting functions that in practice, they can be computed a posteriori. So if you have an oracle, basically previous knowledge about the behavior of a Turing machine, then you can calculate its halting function. But of course, that would give you new level of, or let's say another Turing machine that includes that oracle, and that would, that machine, higher order machine would have another halting function, and that you wouldn't be able to calculate a priori unless you have another oracle. And like that, you have an infinite regression. So, I mean, the question whether our mind is computable or not is open, because there have been many proposals of so-called hypercomputing processes, but as far as I know, all of them have been able to reduce to a Turing machine. So one of these was parallel Turing machines. Then this can be modeled by a single Turing machine. Since you have infinite time, then you don't care that it might take much longer than a parallel process, but you can still simulate a system of parallel Turing machines with a single Turing machine. I'm not sure about quantum computing, but it seems to me that you can also simulate it with a Turing machine, even when in some cases it might take forever to calculate something that in a quantum computer it would be, let's say, taking a finite amount of time. But anyway, in human language, we have polysemy, meaning that the same word can have different meanings. We have polynomy, meaning that different words have the same meaning. We have contextuality, sarcasm, irony, ambiguity. Some concept that we were developing with some students, it's something that we're calling anti-information, that it's still not well defined, but the intention was to describe the information you get when you don't get any information. Let's say the information you derive. So, for example, we might agree with a friend. Well, I don't know, if we'll meet tomorrow, I'll call you. And if I don't call you, then we don't meet. So there is no transmission of information if I don't call you. but then you know that we won't meet. So where does that information come from? So I would call that anti-information in the sense that there was no information sent, but you have an agreement, and that lack of signal has meaning. So I mean, that's something that we can use in daily life, but along with the other properties I mentioned, but we haven't formalized them properly. So, of course, also our human minds are limited, but I think it's clear that we can do many things that computers can't do. So, of course, there's the question, well, what is that difference? What makes us more capable in certain ways? And also the question that we will see later, whether we can learn from that difference and whether machines can manage to somehow imitate our way of thinking or human cognition. So that would be one first limit, that artificial intelligence is based on formal system. It runs on computers, and we don't. It seems that makes a big difference. Still, we still don't understand precisely what is that difference, but that's something we would like to frame more precisely. So if you have any suggestions, they're welcome. So we also spoke about downward causation recently. Well, on Tuesday we spoke about the downward causation. And I think that's another limitation for classical artificial intelligence, in the sense that formal systems can't model downward causation so far, because it would be equivalent to changing the rules of a game or of a system or the axioms of a formal system. So the formal systems we have so far, you have the axioms, and then since they are axioms, you can't change them. And with downward causation, in principle, you would be able to have axioms or theorems that you already derived and you already proved. But then from the derivations of these axioms and theorems, you could come up with some other theorems that would change the axioms and theorems that you proved already. And this cannot happen with the formal systems that we have now. And since that's what we do in our world, we can change, let's say, from higher scale to lower scale. We can change our rules. We can change our behavior. Then this limits the capabilities of artificial intelligence. And I mean, one could say that, yes, you can model it in practice, like with Oracle machines, but those are specific cases, and we haven't found a way to do it generally. So to use again the example of the plastic bottle, or perhaps an easier example is chemical synthetic elements. That's, I mean, they're in the periodic table, but you cannot find them in nature. So these are created by humans, but if you simulate in a computer physics and chemistry, you won't get them. You need to simulate life and evolution and humans and culture and language and technology and so on. And then all of that creates a change in chemistry. So say the causal chains of our daily behavior go very deep, so that we let's say we cannot just cut them and simulate, okay, we will abstract only what we observe, and then we will have realistic artificial intelligence, and we can forget about everything else because it's kind of occurring at different scales. So if you have to simulate too much, then that's also not feasible, and that would be another limitation for getting realistic artificial intelligence. And contextuality, it's something that we use constantly. I mean, not only in language, but in language it's well known. It allows us to to minimize to maximize the amount of information we transmit while minimizing the length of messages. So simply using pronouns saves us from repeating subjects constantly. So that's like, I guess every or most languages have pronouns. It's very convenient. But of course, sometimes that leads to ambiguities because you might be speaking about two people, and then if you say that person, who were you referring to? And of course, that's ambiguity, and that can lead to confusion and problems and misunderstandings. But we pay the price because it's let's say, even when we have such ambiguities that in some cases actually may be beneficial, the benefit of making communication more efficient through contextuality is worth it. But computers have a difficult time with contextuality because this ambiguity, it means that in some conditions, some things apply, and in some other conditions, some other things apply. And I mean, there have been some efforts to try to model this, but again, it's kind of very particular. And of course, we also make mistakes about contextuality, and we make jokes about mistakes people make about contextuality. Like, I should add to this slide a picture I took over the weekend in the near Paso de Cortes, which says, forbidden to hunt and don't throw garbage. So is it forbidden not to throw garbage, meaning that we have to throw garbage? And of course, these are like separate clauses, but there are no parentheses. And of course, in natural language, we don't use parentheses to separate these kind of things. Or I mean, there are plenty of examples when you change something slightly and then you get a different meaning of phrases. And so this is another limit of artificial intelligence. But of course, we solve it somehow. So perhaps we can extrapolate that way or find new ways of solving contextuality. But so far, we have that limit. And finally, another topic that we've spoken about extensively is computational irreducibility. So this I already mentioned that in order to convincingly replicate or simulate the behavior of a human, we need to go way back into our causal history of the universe to be able to have this flexibility. So even when computers have a huge power that has increased exponentially, we're still very far from being able to simulate, let's say, a single organism at the molecular level. And we are understanding that even if we manage to do so, that is not enough. We need to simulate almost all the universe in order to properly simulate what we have now, because our causal chains go all the way back to the Big Bang. We cannot say, okay, let's go just to the origin of humans, and then we'll start our simulation from there. And of course, if you want to simulate the whole universe, you enter again Russell's paradox, because if you have a simulation in the universe that simulates the whole universe, it would need to be simulating itself as well. And of course, that wouldn't fit in the computer. So that's kind of a way of showing that you basically cannot simulate the whole universe in the computer. So, I mean, I don't know whether this proves that the matrix will never be possible. It's something like the matrix. But actually, I don't know whether anyone has taken this idea of the metaverse seriously, because for me, it's just like virtual spaces with a new name so that Facebook can evade the scandals they got from Instagram and things like that. I mean, I don't think it's anything different from what we've been having. Maybe you do have like better graphics or more integration or perhaps larger communities, but I don't think it's much more about it. But I've seen some announcements of people kind of implying that it's something that will transform our society. And I'm like, well, yeah, I think it's more like a marketing move. But anyway, we go beyond those limits somehow. So how do we do it? Well, first of all, we're not formal systems. We don't have axioms. So we don't have problems with incompleteness, with undecidability, and so on, with inconsistency. We can handle paradoxes and contradictions and ambiguity, no problem. We can change our own axioms. Of course, we cannot change, let's say, the physics of our bodies or our elements. I mean, we also have limits, of course. But let's say at the information level, it seems that we don't have the same limits of formal systems. We can use formal systems to describe part of our cognitive processes, but it seems that our cognitive process go beyond that. And it's interesting because what happens with formal systems is that we do have logics that can handle contradictions. They're called paraconsistent logics. But when you, I mean, one of the axioms of logic is the principle of the excluded middle, which tells us that something can be either true or false, and it cannot be something else. And then you can just throw that axiom off and say, okay, we'll have a logic that will have contradictions or paradoxes, and there are several examples like Lukasiewicz logic. And when I was an undergrad, I proposed another paraconsistent logic called multidimensional logic. That is a generalization of fuzzy logic, and you can do all sorts of things. There's also neutrosophic logic, and well, there are like as many logics as logicians are in the world, because you can just define it and put your own rules, your own axioms, and then derive what consequences those axioms you chose will have. But the problem is that when you throw away the principle of the excluded middle, or that axiom, then many proofs of formal systems don't hold anymore. In the sense that if you allow contradictions, or if you allow ambiguity, or if you allow contextuality, then you're not sure about many things anymore. So 1 + 1 may be 2, and it may be 10. If you change the base from to base 2, then it's 1 0. And but that's precisely you want. We want formal systems to be with inequivocus or something like that. I don't know whether that's the proper word in English, but that there's no ambiguity. We want that the result of 1 + 1 always to be 2. And of course, we can say, okay, we will change the base, and now it will be base 2, and it will be 1 0, the result. But then that's a different axiom, and then we all agree on that change. And then on that frame of reference, that result will always be the same. And in real life, that doesn't necessarily hold. We are finding exceptions all the time for many things. So we are contextual, and let's say the way in which we can model the way we are with formal systems, we either have fixed axioms, and then we can prove lots of things, but then we have inconsistency, so we cannot handle contradictions. That's one limit. Or we allow for contradictions, but then we cannot prove, and we have ambiguity, and things can change. And we also don't want that, especially if we're building systems. Let's say if we have a robot, we don't want them to be temperamental. And say, oh, I don't want to work today because I'm feeling moody. and we do that. And of course, that's not consistent in more than one sense of the word, in the logical sense and also behavioral sense of the word. But we don't want robots to do that. So that would be necessary if we want them to have something like artificial general intelligence. But it seems we cannot have both at the same time. So I think that limits inherently what machines will be able to do. Another limit of machines is what in cognitive science has been explored already for a few decades, is that our cognition is embedded in an environment, inactive and extended. So if you're interested about more, you can go to Coursera and go in the specialized program on artificial intelligence. There's a very short course on embodied cognition. In Spanish, is mente encarnada. And there I explain these things in more detail. It's very quickly. It's like just a few hours the whole course, and it gives you an introduction to the concept of 4E cognition. So I guess we have to better frame or decide explicitly what are the differences between humans and machines. And yeah, that's something we are working on. So then the final question is, well, okay, this is our technology so far, but perhaps in 100 years or 1,000 years, maybe we'll be able to overcome each of these limits. But I think that we need to overcome all of this. I mean, I mentioned 4 limits, but maybe there are more limits to current AI. So for the first limits, the question would be whether we can build artificial systems that go beyond formal systems, that are not based on formal systems. But yeah, as I mentioned, if we allow ambiguity, then we lose proofs, or many proofs would not be able to be made. Maybe we could find a compromise, and it's like, okay, we could have contextual proofs, but then this would allow us to have contextuality, and then we could be more flexible about it. But I don't know whether this is a viable path. About downward causation, we also have spoken about this. I mean, I guess first we need to convince more people that downward causation is real. But also we need a breakthrough so that we have a better representation of downward causation in formal systems. That it seems to me that, like, I mean, this has been the case in the many times in the history of science, that if we don't have the proper tools to study something, then we just throw it under the carpet and forget it for a few centuries, and then let's hope someone comes with the proper tools, and then we will be able to study. And a case of that is irrational numbers. So the Greeks and very probably other cultures already knew about irrational numbers because, I mean, the Greeks already knew that, I mean, you have Pythagoras' theorem. So if you have a square triangle of which hypotenuse has length 1, then by Pythagoras' theorem, the length of each of the sides of that square triangle would be square root of 2, because it would be 1 square plus 1 square, and then you get the square root of that, and that's square root of 2. And they knew that you couldn't get a finite expression for square root of 2. So they were aware of that, but since the Greeks were handling geometry more in terms of ratios rather than with precise numbers, with real numbers, they kind of forgot about it and didn't mention it. And it was until the late 19th century that Georg Cantor managed to define properly infinitesimal numbers. So yeah, I mean, it was like 2,400 years or something like that we had to wait to be able to speak about irrational numbers and square root of 2, and no one would be saying that that those numbers didn't exist. I mean, same about imaginary numbers, I guess. Once they were defined, then we were able to do many things that we were unable to do if you don't consider imaginary numbers as real, which is a bit weird because precisely they are not real but imaginary. But anyway, yeah, I mean, there are many calculations that you need a complex plane, and if you don't have a complex plane, then you can't do many things. So perhaps something similar will happen with downward causation, that right now we don't have the proper tools to think about downward causation. And that's why we are kind of ignoring it and assuming that there's just upward causation. And perhaps in a few centuries or perhaps in a couple of years, one of you might come up with a good idea and say, okay, we can describe formally downward causation. And then people say, oh, yes, of course, it was always there, like irrational numbers before Cantor. So yeah, I think that's something we also need in order to go beyond the limits of artificial intelligence, because we do go beyond those limits. I mean, we do have causal influence over lower scales. So we would expect that machines also have that same capability. About contextuality, I think that might be more feasible or let's say closer to being achieved by computers. It might be that it's still not general enough, but I can imagine that there are ways of defining context. So for example, Marvin Minsky has, well, perhaps his most famous book is The Society of Mind from 84 or 86, I forget. And in there, he has a phrase which I like, which says the question is not whether machines can have emotions or not, but whether intelligent machines can have emotions or not, but whether a machine can be intelligent without emotions. And then, like 20 years later, he worked on a book called The Emotion Machine. I mean, it took him years to finish it, but he was kind of releasing each chapter online so that people could look at it and give him comments. So it was like a long process, but I mean, it's published. There's a copy in the library here at IMAS. So if you want, you can check it out. But he basically says already in this book, already from this century, that emotions are behavior modulators. So they allow us, and if we implement them in machines, they would also allow machines to have different reactions for the same conditions. So, for example, he gives the example that we tolerate much more from people we love than from people we don't love. He doesn't speak about hate, but let's say it's natural to think that the people we are closer to, we will allow them to do things that we would normally be offended if other people would do. So, I mean, that's just one example, but another example is that we clearly change behavior, whether we are with our parents or with our kids or with our peers or with our teachers. And of course, this doesn't mean that we are hypocrites, or maybe it does. Of course, it depends on how you define hypocrisy. But it means that we basically behave differently in different contexts. And Minsky says that this is because of emotions, which for him, they can be formally modeled as internal variables. And depending on those variables, I mean, you mix them with your external perceptions and with your memory, and then that will decide your behavior in a richer way. So in a way, it's also like having a bit of a memory or a contextual variable inside. So it seems there are ways of implementing contextuality. But so far, it seems we have found ways of hardwiring it. And ideally, we should be able to find ways in which this contextuality should be learned. But I think I see that's the easiest of the four to solve. We're already in the process. And about computational irreducibility, we can speak about the evolvability of intelligence, meaning that we somehow evolve. I mean, we are we are already here, so we follow some process. So in theory, we should be able to reproduce that process in a machine, and in theory, sooner or later, maybe it will take eons. Those machines should have similar properties to the ones we have, because let's say otherwise we would need to speak about intelligent design, and there's no mechanism that would allow us for human intelligence, and I guess most people working with AI don't agree with that hypothesis. So actually, this is what evolutionary robotics does. The term was coined in the 90s, early 90s perhaps. People from Sussex University, like Inman Harvey and Phil Husbands, they started using evolutionary algorithms that they're attributed to John Holland in the 1970s. But most of genetic algorithms are working on software, and Inman and Phil and others started doing evolution on hardware. Adrian Thompson started doing evolution on chips or computer chips. And there were some advances, and there's still a community of evolutionary robotics, but they have found other limits in the sense that it's difficult to scale up the solutions of evolutionary processes. Actually, in general, in evolutionary computation, because you have the same problems, even if evolution is just in software. And actually, also in neural networks, you have the same, that you can kind of evolve or train or learn a system to find a solution to a problem. But then when you want to go to higher scales or to combine solutions, you can't without hardwiring. So you could kind of evolve process, and then you find a solution, and then you manually put together those solutions, and then maybe you could evolve how these different modules interact. But of course, we want evolution to do it everything on its own, and that scalability has been a huge bottleneck. We haven't managed to have perhaps way of calling it would be multi-scale evolution, that you have different scales of problems, and these through evolution combine naturally to find a higher level solution to a problem that has many components. In my case, because we divide artificially those problems, and let's say we will still need to find a way so that an evolutionary algorithm would find the best way of dividing those processes. And moreover, it seems that artificial evolution is also implemented in a formal system. So why shouldn't they have the same limits of formal systems that we mentioned for artificial intelligence? And in fact, this should also apply to soft and hard artificial life. To wet artificial life, not, because that's on chemistry. So in principle, you could have it, but also the scalability on chemistry, well, on wet life and on genetic engineering. Maybe you know about these iGEM competitions where people, well, mainly students, they were having competitions on designing bacteria with artificial, well, not artificial. They're already for maybe 20 years or more, some genetic libraries of genes, and then you know that these genes produces this function or this protein or whatever. So the idea was that just like programmers grab functions from libraries and then they make some piece of software that does something, engineers would be able to take genes from these libraries and just mix and match and do something that does something arbitrary. So for example, some of the early prizes, yes, I didn't ask whether this is the IGEM competition at MIT. Yes, it's precisely that, about engineering synthetic organisms. So some of the first interesting projects that came out there were like developing bacteria that smell like banana. And it's like, well, okay, you put the gene of banana and then they smell like banana. And well, okay, very well. But they were not scalable because the genes, let's say, they have a specific function, but in hardware and in software, you can isolate the interactions between components. And in a cell, everyone mixes with everyone. So when let's assume you have a gene that does, I don't know, fluorescent bodies and a gene that has banana smell, and then you put them together, but they interact in such a way that they lose their functionality. So that limits scalability if it's not through evolution, and that of course takes millions of years. So it seems that here we have the limits of computational irreducibility. I don't know whether they will be overcome or not, but okay. Just to conclude, implications are several. The first is to realize that there are several limits to artificial intelligence as we know it. So trying to be more realistic about what our technology will be able to do and won't be able to do. I think that's important to have this realistic perspective. First of all, so that we focus on our efforts on the things that we will be able to do and not to lose time with things that are unfeasible. And also because many of if we trust too much on technology, assuming that they will be able to generalize things that are not able to generalize, then we will be basically building systems that will make mistakes that can be preventable because we trusted too much on that technology and we assume that they would be able, for example, to generalize or to adapt to things that they weren't able to do. So I think that the implication is not so much that, this is the end of AI. I think that my purpose, it's the opposite, is, okay, let's continue doing AI, but without all the buzz that many pseudoscientists have brought forward for different purposes. I mean, in some cases, it's just to get more funding. You exaggerate your claims and say, we will be able to do this and that. In other cases, it might be just out of ignorance that people assume, we will manage to do these things. Just give us the money. And I think it's useful to be more realistic about what are the capabilities of the systems that we're building. Because also this will allow us to have more focused discussions about the ethics related to this technology, in the sense that we will be able to save energies and not spend time discussing about the trolley problem and things like that when we don't even understand what are the limits of autonomous vehicles. So yeah, that's something that is work in progress. So if you have comments and questions. Well, in the chat, Odin wrote, in the field of ecology, there's this disputed framework called niche construction that links with the extended evolutionary synthesis. Well, this is a kind of downward causation that started, it's being accepted slowly. It sort of says that organism can modify the space they live and accordingly modify its genetics to adapt to the new environment. Yes, actually, there's latest podcast episode from Mindscape podcast from Sean Carroll. He interviewed Stephen Dawkins about his new book on flight. I mean, it's interesting. Not Perhaps this is his least controversial book, but still interesting. But his most famous book, The Selfish Gene, it assumes that genetics have just upward causation. I mean, that genes determine what organisms will do, and then organisms don't determine which genes will be transferred. And of course they do. I mean, because selection occurs not only, it doesn't occur at the genetic level, it occurs at multiple levels, at the individual level, at the ecosystem level. So, for example, Alexandra Penn, some of her PhD work was about multi-level selection, and she speaks about the selection of ecosystems, that you could also see that, let's say, there's selective pressure at those ecosystem scales. And if you have an ecosystem that is more fit than other, then that will be selected, and all the species within it will prevail over others. Yeah. You know, Odin writes that the problem with Dawkins is that he ignores on purpose Waddington. Yeah. Any more comments or questions? Okay, so just as a reminder, next Tuesday is a holiday. It's Mother's Day in Mexico, and I don't know whether in other countries. So we'll meet on the 12th, next Thursday. Again, it will be online only. And I will see you there. So have a great weekend. Celebrate your mothers.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
You too. Bye.